And hello everyone and welcome to my channel. I am a gaming PC hardware reviewer from France and I have been doing this kind of content for a couple of years now on my main channel, so it's not coming out of nowhere. If you have doubts, you can always check the French one. Anyway, today we are taking a look at the PC port of Horizon Forbidden West and its CPU and GPU performance. Let's go. So, Horizon Forbidden West is a sequel to Horizon Zero Dawn. It's a cross-gen game released on both PS4 and PS5 about 2 years ago. The game is based on the Decima engine, found in the first Horizon, but also on Death Stranding. Horizon is developed by Guerrilla Games, to whom we also owe the Killzone franchise. As for Horizon, it's a franchise that's doing quite alright, even if each time a game releases, it ended up facing other big titles that tends to overshadow it. Zero Dawn was released at the same time as Zelda Breath of the Wild, and Forbidden West was released at the same time as Elden Ring. And for the PC port, it came out at the same time as Dragon's Dogma 2. I guess it's a kind of curse at this point. And as far as the game goes, some people enjoy it and others find it kind of bland. Personally, I don't really like it gameplay-wise. It's too classic of an open world and the story really never won me over either. And it's mostly for its technical aspect that the title always felt pretty interesting to me. And for Forbidden West, despite the fact that it's a cross-gen title released 2 years ago, the game remains very good looking and clearly one of the best looking game around still right now. I kind of like the setting too, post-apocalyptic with mech animals, that's pretty badass, but every time I tried to play the game kinda fell from my hands, so I understand the criticism for this title. If you happen to like Horizon, keep enjoying it, that's awesome. But anyway, let's get back to our PC port. If you remember, the Zero Dawn PC port had a bunch of technical issues. It was the first PC port for Guerrilla and Virtuos Studios, and Nixxes had to be called kind of to the rescue to fix the game after a pretty bad launch. As for Forbidden West, Nixxes is in charge again, which is usually a good thing because oftentimes it means a good PC port. It's not always perfect at launch, but most of the times there are no major issues like we had last year with The Last of Us Part 1, and most of the bugs and performance or missing features will be likely added later on too. For this PC port, we have the complete edition with the Burning Shores DLC included. PC features, we got added support for ultra-wide monitors, unlocked FPS, and for upscaling we got DLSS, FSR, and XeSS, which is great. It's also an NVIDIA-sponsored title, so we also get DLAA and Reflex. No ray tracing support, which is not all that surprising, since unlike many other PC ports from Insomniac games that already have ray tracing support on consoles, Nixxes probably just had to add more advanced RT option for those games. But for Decima engine, no RT on console, and so no RT on PC either, probably because the basis to work on it is missing, I guess. But I don't think it's that big of a problem. I'd rather not see any RT than a sloppy implementation just to say it's in the game. Frame generation wise, there is only DLSS frame generation, no FSR3, which is a shame, but I heard that it will be coming later on. And if we look at other Nixxes PC ports, I don't think any got FSR3 yet. We just heard a couple of days ago that FSR 3.1 will be added to Ratchet & Clank later this year. So we can assume that they are working on their FSR integration, and I wouldn't be all too surprised to see mod support for FSR3 frame generation before official supports come out. And compared to PS5, we don't get much else upgrade-wise. According to Digital Foundry, we mainly get better anisotropic filtering and better LOD levels and better upscaler, better than on PS5 and its checkerboard. And while we are talking about PC upscalers, well, they look pretty decent. I was a bit scared for FSR2 since we get a ton of foliage and grass, which is one of its big weakness. But aside of 1080p, where it's not really great, with pretty mid disocclusion artifacts around the characters, some graininess on some effects, as well as some ghosting on small elements and particles. All in all, it's not the worst implementation I have seen, and in 4040p quality or 4K balance, it's pretty decent, even if DLSS and XeSS remain cleaner overall. Menus-wise, Nixxes did a pretty good job too. Bonus point for the graphics menu, because when you change the settings in-game, you can directly see what it changed on the screen, which is really what we would like to see in all games as far as menu goes. And since it's a cross-gen game, which was pretty decent looking even on PS4, I hope that the game will also run well on fairly modest hardware on PC, and good news, that's the case. 40 FPS on average on a GTX 1060 with low details at 1080p, it's pretty decent, and it's still pretty good looking. It's playable, and there is still upscaling available if you absolutely want a bit more performance. But with older GPUs, I would probably go for low settings with FSR and get a softer image, rather than going for the very low presets, which look much worse to me, but to each their own. As for the presets, as usual, the difference between high and very high is pretty slim, and even the medium preset look pretty good. I heard there was a performance issue when you use a PS5 controller, and that was already patched up, so good job Nixes for the quick fix. And I also heard to avoid using Reflex with boost mode, as it seemed to cause some problems with the frame rate. Also, it seems that the game does not use resizable bar on GeForce, even though it can give a performance boost in some situation when forced in NV Inspector. So I hope Nvidia will add the game to their whitelist for rebar, because I don't really understand why they often add the game much later on that list, or sometimes never, even when they can benefit from it. But anyway, let's get to those benchmarks. As usual, I chose the high preset. The bench scene is 1 minute long. It's pretty early in the game, but it looked like an interesting spot, as performance can drop a bit in the midsection of it. There is about 25 GPUs tested and 8 CPUs, and we will also check how DLSS frame generation behaves in the game. And I am using the latest drivers from AMD and Intel and Nvidia. They were released a couple of days ago with profiles for this game. So we begin with 1080p, and we can see that it's a GPU EV game, since there is no major CPU bottleneck at 1080p, other than for the 1490 that's pretty close to it. And so we kinda see the typical rankings. The RX 7900s are doing quite well. The XTX is a notch above the 4080 Super, and the 7900 XT is only slightly behind the 4080. The 4070 Ti Super is slightly above the 4070 Super, which in turn wins over the 7900 GRE by a narrow margin, even if 1% wise, the GRE have the edge. The 4070, the 3080 and the 7800 XT are neck and neck, even if for the 1% we can see that the 40 series is not as good as RDNA 3 and RTX 30 series. The 7700 XT is kinda alone in the middle of that chart, followed by the 6700 XT and the 4060 Ti's, followed closely by the 3060 Ti. The battle between the 4060 and 7600 ends in a draw here, followed by the everlasting 1080 Ti, even if we are just short of the 60 FPS average. The 3060 is doing okay-ish at around 50 FPS and is just next to the A770 from Intel and the RX 6600 with the A750, just a couple % behind. At the bottom of the chart, the 2060 isn't really doing amazing here at around 30 FPS, and the 1060 and A380 are also kinda struggling with high settings. And while we are talking about Intel GPUs, I found that they have some slight frame time issues on this title. There were the least stable GPUs with small stutters and weren't as smooth as AMD or Nvidia GPUs, which can be seen in the frame time graph here, where we can see that the 3060 is much more stable on the test scene. In 4040p now, the 4090 takes the lead over the other cards, even if the 7900 XTX also does very well. 4080 Super and 7900 XT are not that far behind either. The 4060 Ti Super is a bit further ahead of the 4070 Super now, probably thanks to its greater bandwidth, which become more important than in 1080p, likely something for the 7900 GRE, now ahead of the 4070 Super by a short lead, but the 1% are still better on RDNA 3 and Ampere than on Lovelace. The 7800 XT is now ahead of the 4070 and the 3080, even though you will get mostly the same gaming experience on those three cards. The 7700 XT is still alone in the middle of the chart. Right behind, we get a bunch of GPUs with the 6700 XT, 4060 Ti and 3060 Ti getting about the same performance. The 4060 takes a slight lead over the 7600 in 4040p, just like the A770, which is often the case with Arc. It maintains itself better in 4040p than its direct competitors like the 3060, that ends up a bit behind now. And at the bottom of the chart, the A750 and 6600, and finally the 2060. I didn't bother with the 1060 and A380 in 4040p, since they already were struggling at 1080p. In 4040p Ultra right now, well, same thing as we saw with Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart. The performance gap with 1440p is really small, much smaller than most other games, which is kinda strange, but it is what it is. I won't waste much time here. It's the same ranking as 4040p, with roughly 5 FPS less for all cards, and at this resolution I am no longer testing cards below the 6700 XT and 3060 Ti. 4K now, well, it's a heavy game, but we have seen worse. The 4090 goes now just below the 100 FPS average, and it's about 15% ahead of the XTX, which is doing pretty good here. The 4080 Super is around 12% behind the XTX, with the 7900 XT close behind. Small gap down, the 4070 4060 Ti Super, which is now just slightly ahead of the 7900 GRE, followed by the 4070 Super, which still keeps a small lead over the 7800 XT, 3080 and 4070. As usual, the 7700 XT is alone, followed by a bunch of cards which hang around 30 FPS on average, but if you add a bit of upscaling on those cards, they will probably get close to 60 FPS average with decent image quality. We are moving to CPU performance now, and well, as you can see here, the game is much more GPU bound than CPU bound. At 1080p, performances between the CPUs are almost identical, aside from the Ryzen 3600, which is clearly below the others, since it's bottlenecking the 4090 in 1080 and 4040p. The i3 3100 or the Ryzen 5600 are doing pretty good here, and don't forget that we are using a 4090 here. With a weaker card, if you check the GPU charts we just saw earlier, you can see that in the end the Ryzen 3600 will manage cards like the 3080 or 7800 XT in this game just fine. Let's take a look at DLSS frame generation now. I wanted to see how it behaves in this title, and as you can see here, scaling wise we find a behavior that we already seen in the past in other games for cards such as the 4060 and 4060 Ti. The smoothness gains from the frame generation is not exactly amazing, since even in 1080p the 4060 goes from 74 FPS with DLSS quality to 83 FPS with frame generation. A small 12% gain, and given that we are increasing latency at the same time and still getting kinda low FPS level for frame generation, it ended up feeling worse than just using DLSS upscaling. Same story for the 4060 Ti. We see that the 8GB model in 1080p is scaling just fine, even if we don't gain much compared to DLSS with the same 12% gain we had with the 4060. But in 4040p, as you can see here, we now lose performance compared to DLSS, while the 16GB model does not have this problem. It's just because Nvidia's frame generation used some VRAM and the 8GB model does not have enough here, even if, yeah, it doesn't change the fact that it's still a better experience without frame generation than with it, even for the 16GB model. For the faster cards now, we see a similar behavior. At 1440p, we see that once again, it's a more powerful card that benefits the most from frame generation, which is kind of sad. The scaling is a bit better than with the 4060s, but the 4070s are gaining between 15 and 20%. The 4080 Super is about 23% better, and the 4090 26% better over DLSS. And at 4K it's the same thing. Good news, 12GB of VRAM is enough for this game. We don't get the same problem as the 4060 Ti 8GB, but once again it's the 4090 which benefits the most from frame generation with almost 30% better, while other cards are closer to 20. So for those who wonder why, we already saw this behavior several times on the channel. Nvidia's frame gen is not free, and the fact that it's a card with the most tensor cores that scale the best is not very surprising. And we also saw in the past that DLSS 3 frame generation, depending on the games, does not always bring a very big gain, and sometimes even lowers performance, like on Diablo 4 or Yakuza Gaiden. And it's often on games with heavy CPU use that Nvidia's frame generation brings the most gains. So overall, this Forbidden West PC port is pretty good. No major issues, a few stutters here and there, mostly at the beginning of the game, despite a small shader compilation at first launch. I don't know if there is more stutters later on, but I heard it's not the case, so don't be afraid to say in the comments if that's the case or not. But regardless, Forbidden West is a really gorgeous game, and it's not that heavy compared to some other titles, so it seems pretty well optimized, even if it's not perfect. VRAM-wise, aside from the frame gen issues with the 8GB cards, the game is not that demanding. 8GB of VRAM will do the job at high settings, even at 1440p. It's really only the Intel cards that seem to need a bit more work driver-wise. The frame rate isn't as smooth as on AMD and Nvidia cards, even if it's definitely playable. I ran through most of the game intro with the A770, and when I swapped to the 3060 in 1080p, it just felt much smoother, even though the benchmark says they perform pretty much the same. And I also hope Nvidia will be able to fix the 1% being subpar on the RTX 40 series, even compared to Ampere. It worked great overall, but it's also not the first time I see the 1% being a bit lower on the 40 series than the 30 series. But well, I think that's it for this one. Good job from Nixis once again. Not sure we will be able to say the same thing about Dragon's Dogma 2, which I'm just going to test now. But since the devs already published some apologies for the performance and stability of the game, it doesn't sound too good already. Anyway, if you liked the video, well, like the video. And if you wish to give strength to the channel, you can do the YouTube stuff. And if you want to help directly, there is a Ko-fi page for the channel where I post the benchmarks too. And many thanks to all those that help me directly. That's what is helping me the most. And I hope my English wasn't all too bad here. It had been a long while since I talked that much in English. I know my accent is a little weird. It is what it is. Anyways, see you later for another one. Take care of yourself. Bye.